Hi, thank you all for coming. My name is Penny Goldberg. I'm the outgoing president of the Econometric Society. And in this capacity, I'm going to chair the presidential address that is going to be given by Professor Guido Tabellini. I think it's fair to say that Guido is someone who doesn't need introduction. He doesn't need any introduction anywhere in the world, but this is especially true in Bocconi, an institution that has been his home for a very long time. So Guido came here in 1994 as professor after having been professor, having been faculty in Stanford and at UCLA in the United States. He has stayed here for all these years. He was rector of the university between 2008 and 2012. And since 2013, he has been holding the Intensa San Paolo Chair in Political Economics. So he's very well known in Bocconi and in Italy, but he's also very well known in Europe and the world. In Europe, he was the recipient of the Roy Jansson Award by the European Economic Association. For those of you who don't know the award, this is an award given to the best, to the European economist who has made the most important theoretical or applied contributions in economics and is under the age of 45. A few years ago, he served as president of the European Economic Association, and now, as I said before, he's the president of the Econometric Society, and in this capacity, I had the pleasure to interact with him regularly in the last few years. Guido is also an honorary member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and also a fellow of the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research. And I think it's fair to say that he's a household name in economics and also in political science. His work has had enormous impact, not just in economics, but in social science more generally. It will be very hard to summarize his work in the few minutes I have. Guido has been extremely broad, having made important contributions in macroeconomics, monetary policy, in public economics, of course in political economy, but even in international economics. And so just to give you a taste of his work, let me start on a slightly autobiographical note. I came across Guido's work in my very first year as graduate student at Stanford when I was taking international trade, and one of the papers we covered was the work by Steger and Tabellini on the time consistency of trade policy. And Guido at that time was researching rules versus discretion, and most of his work was related to the credibility of macroeconomic policy, of monetary policy. But in his joint work with Steger, they applied this framework also to international economics, and that was a truly novel approach to thinking about trade policy. They made the point that in many cases we want trade policy to be discretionary because then it can have a bigger effect on the private sector, but this may give rise to time inconsistencies, and what they showed is that the time-consistent policy implies more protectionism. I ended up writing my very first paper in economics on the time consistency of political economy, of trade policy, and I don't think I ever told Guido that, but actually my very first paper was very much influenced by his work. This is just to say that he's had influence on many fields, including international economics, even though most of us may not think of him as an international economist. His most important contributions have been in the area of public economics and political economy. He's the author of two very influential and highly cited books, both of them joined with Thorsten Persson. The first book is Political Economics, Explaining Economic Policy. And in this book, they cover a range of topics that are very important for public economics and economics more generally, from the type and range of public goods that are offered in an economy to the burden of taxation, debt, deficits, the relationship between monetary policy and the business cycle and the electoral cycles. So a very wide range of topics, and they approach these topics through a common framework that's informed by three different literatures: the macroeconomic literature from economics, the public choice literature from economics and political science, and also the rational choice literature from political science. So this is a book that's a must-read for both economists and political scientists. It's mostly theoretical in nature, but it was followed by another book that's more empirical, and that shows Guido's breadth. He has straddled theory and empirics. In his second book, the second book is titled The Economic Effects of Constitutions, and there they investigate the relationship between political constitution systems and economic policies, investigating the effects that, let's say, presidential systems have proportional elections, many of the different features of political systems. And naturally, one of the big challenges one faces in this type of work is that political systems and constitutions are not exogenous. Countries select into them, so that the book goes into great detail in addressing these issues. So these two books are indicative of the kind of work that Guido does, and also the range of the methods he brings to the analysis. There is always a theoretical foundation to his work that informs the empirical analysis. There is a very important question. There is often a very rich set of data. Sometimes the data is historical in nature, spanning many centuries. Sometimes the data looks at regions within countries and more recent periods. And in the end, the results speak to questions that are of enormous importance for economics and social science more generally. In his presidential address to the European Economic Association, for example, that many of you may have heard, he investigates the relationship between culture and institutions. By culture, we mean primarily metrics such as trust, confidence in self-determination. And in that work, he explored within country regional variation to offer a credible identification strategy. In other work, he has investigated fiscal deficits and public debts, making the point that sometimes deficits and debt are used strategically by policymakers to influence the decisions of subsequent governments. So we would expect to see higher debt when you have polarization and when a government is not sure it's going to stay in power. He has explored the separation of powers and political accountability. And in some of his work, he has also explored the relationship between inequality and growth. One of his papers, for example, from 1991, makes the point that more unequal societies tend to exhibit less growth. As with all his work, there is a theoretical model that provides the foundation of the analysis. Interestingly, this is a political economy model in which more distributional conflict, less equality leads a country to adopt policies that are less conducive to growth because individuals have no incentive to invest in human or physical capital. So there is a theoretical analysis, and then there is a very extensive empirical analysis based on cross-country data that shows a very strong negative correlation between growth and inequality. And I mention this paper because these days the relationship between growth and inequality is a hotly debated topic, but this is a paper that was written in the early 90s when the whole world, including economists, had embraced unbridled capitalism. And so I think in this work he was way ahead of his time by making a point about inequality that we didn't appreciate until many years later. More recently, Guido has been focusing on the changing nature of political conflict and polarization. He gave a very influential keynote address at the IMF, where he talked about the fact that we used to think about right versus left. Now the nature of political conflict has changed. We often see the right and the left being aligned on issues such as immigration, globalization, identity. And this brings me to the topic of today's presidential address. So the topic of today's address is going to be identity politics, and I'm sure Guido will have a lot of interesting things to say, as always, about this very important issue. So let me stop here. I don't want to take more time away from the presidential address, and I will turn it over to Guido. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you, Penny, for your very, very generous words. I'm really very glad to be here, and it's a great honor and a great privilege to give my presidential lecture, and particularly to do so here in Bocconi, and to do so after a few years in which we could not be together in person. But before I talk about my research, there are a few important things to do. The first, I would like to thank, on behalf of the Econometric Society, the individuals who organized this Congress. Events like this don't happen spontaneously. They require a lot of work and commitment, and so I want to thank the people who did this work and made this very interesting Congress possible. So first of all, I would like to thank the program chairs of the Econometric Society part of ESEM, and in particular Ingvild Almas and Vasilikis Krete. I also want to thank my colleague Massimiliano Marcellino, who chaired the local organizing committee, and I should say he chaired the local organizing committee for this event, but a few years ago we held the World Congress, and he was also chair of the local organizing committee, so a lot of work, and thank you, Massimiliano. I want to take this opportunity to thank my colleagues in the European Regional Standing Committee, and in particular the secretary of the committee, Sven Reddy, and the treasurer, Olivier Scayet, who have continued to be involved with the society over the years. I also want to thank Gemma Pruner-Thomas of the EEA and Lynn Hogan, who worked very hard on the Econometric Society Executive Director, who worked very hard also to organize this event. And finally, thank you to the European Economic Association and its officers, and to Bocconi for cooperating in arranging this event. And I want to talk about recent work that I have been doing with my Bocconi colleague, Nicola Gennaioli. So the work that we are doing is motivated by what is happening in several Western democracies, and in particular by two stylized facts, some of which were mentioned by Penny in her introduction. The first is the emergence of a new cleavage in several democracies. There is evidence that voters and parties are increasingly divided by cultural issues more than by issues of redistribution and economics, despite the fact that inequality has risen. And this is observed from survey data and in party platforms. And there are many ways of showing this. This particular picture looks at data from the American National Election Studies, survey data, and illustrates with the dotted line the variance on the principal component of a number of questions on cultural issues like civil rights or immigration or race relations, and the variance on the principal component on attitudes towards redistribution. As you see, the variance on attitudes towards cultural policy has increased over time, and instead variance over redistribution, if anything, has decreased. And there are other ways of showing similar trends in the data, also in party platforms. The second observation has been emphasized in recent work by Thomas Piketty, is the fact that we are also observing a political realignment of voters among parties, of social groups between parties, again, in many countries, not just in the US. And in particular, voters now sort among parties based on their education and probably by their cultural attitudes, rather than by their economic position in society. And in particular, in the past, left-wing parties used to overrepresent poor voters, and now they instead overrepresent the more highly educated voters and also voters based in urban areas. And the opposite for right-wing parties. And of course, this realignment of voters across parties plays out differently in different countries based on their electoral system, but it's also behind the rise of support for right-wing populist parties. So to illustrate some of these facts, again for the US from the American National Election Studies, here you see on the left the groups that identify themselves as Democrats, on the right the groups that identify themselves as Republican. And in particular, you show the difference between Democrats in specific groups. So the yellow line is the difference in Democrats between the secular versus the religious. The gray line is the difference between urban and rural, or the difference between the highly educated and the rest of the population, the very rich and the rest of the population. And as you see, in the past, the very rich were underrepresented by the Democratic Party, and now they are about equally represented. And instead, the groups that are overrepresented by the Democratic Party tend to be the highly educated, the urban, and the secular voters. And similar trends are occurring in many other Western countries. Now, it is not clear whether both of these changes, the changing dimensions of conflict and the realignments, are due to changes on the demand side of politics or on the supply side of politics. If they originate in shifts in voters' preferences, then a natural question is what is triggering these changes in voters' preferences. And in particular, it is somewhat puzzling because the evidence also shows that the support for right-wing populist platforms is highest amongst economically insecure voters. So these economically insecure voters seem to have shifted towards parties that advocate platforms that seem to run counter their obvious economic interest. If instead the changes are due to shifts that originate on the supply side, then this could be the case, but there are also some questions here. Why do we see very similar changes occurring in countries that have very different party system and political systems? And also, you observe these changes also in the preferences of voters who declare to be independent, not identified or supporters of particular parties. And these independent voters are less likely to be susceptible to political persuasion. So a supply-side story would have to explain also why independent voters seem to have shifted their policy preferences. So what we do in this paper and in recent research is to focus on the demand side of politics and try to explain these changes within the framework of social identity theory. And so the main idea here is that the beliefs and value systems of voters are shaped by their endogenous social identities. In the past, individuals identified based on their economic situation with economic groups. And so the emphasis was naturally on redistributive conflict. More recently, instead, social groups like my race, my religion, my local community are carriers of social identities, and this has brought an emphasis on cultural conflict. We then embed this demand-side story in an old idea. We combine it with an old idea by two political scientists, Lipset and Rockham, who argue that parties represent social groups and represent in particular traditional cleavages in society. And so we study what happens to the supply side when the social cleavages driven by these changing social identities also change. So different parties now represent different social groups. And finally, we show how this framework can also accommodate feedbacks from the supply to the demand through political persuasion. So to give concreteness to this idea that social identity is at the heart of some of these phenomena, we have run a survey on a large sample of US-based respondents. It's a representative sample of respondents. And in this survey, we do two things. We ask respondents with whom do you identify, giving them a closed menu of possible answers. And then we also ask their policy opinions. And two results emerge from the survey. The first, which was a bit surprising to us, but in line with the research that we are doing, is that, as you see, about 2/3 of the respondents identify with a social group defined by their religion, their race, their local community, and so on. The remaining third splits evenly between those who identify with an economic group, like your work being working class, upper middle class, or one of the two political parties. The second finding, which is not surprising, is that, but nevertheless reassuring, is that how you identify correlates with your view of the world. And so we ask a number of questions on cultural policies, civil rights, and on economic, on redistribution. And then we group identities based on whether you identify with a cultural, social, with a progressive social group, like being secular or being a citizen of the world, or a conservative social group. I identify with my religion or my local community. And as you see, the conservative and the progressive disagree sharply, both on cultural policies and economic policies, while the people who identify with an economic group disagree on the economic policies. So, of course, this is just correlation, tells you nothing about causality, but it's suggesting that identity and views of the world are somehow connected. Okay, so we are not, of course, we're not the first to talk about social identity. In fact, ideas in social identity were pioneered many decades ago by social psychologists. And these social scientists viewed social identity as a form of self-categorization. So I perceive myself as a member of a group of similar individuals in contrast to an outgroup. And through experiments, they emphasize two consequences of identification. The first, any process of categorization simplifies perceptions and introduces distortions. When I assign a category to different objects, I tend to accentuate similarities between objects that belong to the same category and exaggerate differences between categories. And second, in a social situation, when I identify with a social group, they argue, you depersonalize, you perceive yourself as an exemplar member of the in-group, and you slant belief towards those that are distinctive of the in-group, and you develop some in-group bias. So they emphasize how social identities can shape beliefs and amplify group conflict. Second, they also stress how we all have several identities. I am Italian, I'm an economist, I belong to a certain age group, and which of these several identities would prevail? Well, they argue, of course, that depends on the social situation, and they emphasize the trade-off that they call the meta-contrast principle. So I tend to identify more easily with the group in the dimension where the contrast between the in-group and the out-group in the salient issues is greatest. And of course, I identify more easily with more similar groups. So now I identify myself as an economist. If I were to watch with you a soccer game between Italy and Germany, I would identify as Italian. So the idea is that changes in the economic and social environment change what is the salient dimension of conflict. They would change social identities, and this would give rise to new social cleavages. So we are not, of course, the first to discuss these issues in economics, and in fact I have seen that in the program there are several papers that discuss identity and economic issues. Let me just mention the papers that are more relevant to what I will be talking about. Of course, identity was brought to the attention of economists more than 2 decades ago by Akerlof and Cranton, who, however, looked more at the consequences of identity. They left identity to be exogenous. In political economy, the seminal work was done by Moses Shayo in his PhD dissertation, who emphasized how identity induces an in-group bias. And in his framework, identity was endogenous, and he emphasized how people used to tend to identify with a group that has a higher status. And I will be talking about recent work that I have been doing with Nicola Gennaioli and the former Bocconi student Giampaolo Bonomi, where identity emerges from this trade-off between contrast and similarity, and the consequences of identity have to do with belief distortions. And of course, the work that I will be talking about is also related to a very large literature on how there are belief distortions in the factual beliefs of voters that are highly correlated with political ideology. So I plan to cover 3 topics. First, I want to summarize briefly the main insights in the paper with Bonomi and Gennaioli on voters, and discuss how social identity can amplify and propagate the effect of changes in society. Second, I want to discuss how the political system adapts to these shifting identities, including allowing a feedback through political persuasion from parties to voters. And finally, I want to discuss the effects of specific economic shocks, and in particular trade shocks, also discussing some of the evidence on the effects of international trade shocks. So let me start with this simple model of identity and voting. Suppose that there are 2 policy tools. We want to discuss 2 dimensions of conflict: a proportional income tax, tau, and the cultural policy, q, such as immigration or civil rights. And suppose that higher values of q correspond to more progressive policies. Because we want to study beliefs, suppose that individuals are uncertain about the policy consequences of these 2 tools. In particular, individuals are uncertain about their future relative income. So epsilon tilde I is a random variable that captures the relative income of individual I, which is unknown to this individual, and it's normally distributed with mean epsilon I. So epsilon I is the expected position in society, the expected relative income of an economic type I. Individuals are also uncertain about the consequences of Q, of this immigration policy, and psi tilde J is the unknown bliss point of an individual of cultural type J, and psi J refers to the expected bliss point of this individual. So if these individuals were rational, an individual of economic type I and cultural type J would have an expected utility which neglecting a constant term, would have this form. This first term is the private consumption of this individual. It's his gross income. Average income in society is 1. So gross income net of taxes. Tax revenue is used to pay for a public good G. There are some tax distortions. And V is a parameter that captures the marginal utility of the public good. So this is the economic welfare of this individual, the first two terms. And then this individual has a loss function which captures the idea that he has a bliss point, psi j, for the cultural policy. And kappa is the relative importance in the welfare function of this individual of the cultural policy. For simplicity, there are 4 types in normalized to 1, and there is a continuum of individuals in each of these 4 types. Individuals can be rich or poor. They can belong to the upper class or to the lower class. The 4 types are of equal size to simplify the algebra. So epsilon u is the relative income of the upper class, and that's epsilon, and minus epsilon is the relative income of the lower class. And then individuals can be progressive or conservatives. The progressives have bliss point psi, and the conservative have bliss point minus psi. So here you see the map of society with the relative income on the horizontal axis and cultural preferences on the vertical axis. On the lower left, there is a lower class conservative, a lower class progressive, and so on. Now, individuals can identify based on their income dimension with their economic group, in which case they see the world as divided between the upper and the lower class, the red and the blue, or they can identify with their cultural type, in which case they see the world as divided between the yellow and the blacks. And as in the social identity literature in psychology, we assume that how you identify shapes your beliefs, and in particular, if you identify with your class, you exaggerate the stereotypes that are distinctive of the economic of the group with which you identify. So formally, we assume that the perceived distribution of these 2 random variables overweights the realizations that are deemed distinctive of the in-group by other in-group members. By distinctive, we mean stereotypical of the in-group, according to the model of stereotyping that was recently worked out by Bordalo and others in a recent paper. And so group beliefs here emerged as a fixed point. And of course, depending on how you identify, you have different stereotypes. If you identify with your class, the poor exaggerate their poverty because being poor is the distinctive feature of the group. The rich exaggerate their richness. And similarly, if you identify with your religion or with another cultural group, then you exaggerate the distinctive features of this group. And so you see how identity here can amplify group conflict, but it does so mostly in the dimension of identification. Here we assume that in the population these 2 traits are uncorrelated, so your beliefs are only distorted in the dimension of your identity, but if these traits were correlated in the population, then the distortion would also apply in the second dimension, but would be smaller. And of course, as identity switches, then the stereotypes would change. We then model endogenous identity following this meta-contrast principle that I discussed as a trade-off between group contrast and similarity. So we define group contrast in the following way, in a natural way, as the difference in welfare of the average member of group G, say the lower class, evaluated at his own bliss point relative to the welfare of the same average group member evaluated at the bliss point of the average member of the outgroup. And then we define similarity in the similar way. And then you compute this contrast between the two possible partitions of society, the upper and lower classes and the opposite cultural groups, and we see which partition optimizes this trade-off between contrast and similarity. And in this simple model, the simple result is that everyone identifies with their cultural group if this inequality holds, otherwise everyone identifies with their class. And the inequality says that cultural conflict is greater than economic conflict. The welfare relevance of cultural conflict is greater than that of economic conflict. Remember, psi square is a measure of cultural disagreement in society. Kappa is the welfare relevance of the cultural policy. Epsilon square is a measure of income inequality, and V is a measure of the benefit of the public good. So the implication of these two results is pretty straightforward. Suppose that initially everyone identifies with their economic class, and then for some reason cultural conflict becomes more relevant, so the individuals care more about immigration or civil rights. Then at some point they will abandon class identity, they will switch to cultural identity, the belief distortions switch, and redistributive conflict is reduced while cultural conflict is exacerbated, because the conservatives perceive themselves as more conservative, and the lower class abandon the notion of class struggle. And this simple explanation is actually consistent with some of the changes that you observe in survey data. So here you see the problems that are mentioned as one of the three most important problems over time in a Pew survey. And you see that immigration and race emerge as more important than many other issues in the early 2000s. Then there is the financial crisis, and these issues become less important. Economic takes forefront. But then once the financial crisis emerges, individuals again think about immigration and race as very important. And notice that this is not due to Trump. It happens before the emergence of Trump. Of course, this refers to the US. And in the paper with Bocconi and Gennaioli, we discuss other implications of the theory which are consistent with survey data. But what I want to do next is to discuss how these identity shifts are then reflected in the political supply and how demand and supply interacts. And because I want to explore the extent to which demand-side changes can explain the motivating facts that I started with, we retain the assumption that political parties do not have their own agenda. They just want to win the election. They're just opportunistic players. And so suppose that there are two parties, R and D, who choose these two policy platforms before the election in order to maximize their vote share. We model electoral competition as in a standard probabilistic voting model. For those of you who are not familiar with this model, essentially it says that voters trade off the economic intensity, the intensity of their policy preferences, the left-hand side of this inequality, against a given idiosyncratic party bias. Delta K is a random variable that is distributed independently across voters. Now, in a standard probabilistic voting model, both parties would converge to a distribution, to a position, to the same position that is determined by the distribution and assumptions of this parameter. But to generate policy divergence, we want to generate policy divergence while retaining the assumption that parties are not partisan, they don't have their own political agenda. We assume that parties have opposite partisan reputations, adapting the framework of Lipset and Rockham to this electoral competition. So, specifically, we assume that some voters in the lower class progressive types do not fully trust the announcements made by Party R. And some voters of the upper class conservative type do not fully trust the announcements made by Party D. One way to justify this assumption is to say that these groups were underrepresented by the two parties historically, and so they pay less attention or trust these announcements less than the remaining groups. And then you solve for the equilibrium and you obtain two simple results. The first is that clearly there is policy divergence now. The Party R does not fully internalize the preferences of the groups that don't trust him, and so chooses more conservative cultural policies and more conservative tax rates, and opposite for Party R, Party D. Second, more important, if identity shifts from class to culture, then the platforms chosen in equilibrium by these two parties change, and you observe more divergence in the policy platforms over the cultural policy between the two parties, and less divergence in their economic policies. In other words, the changes in the dimensions of voters' conflict is fully reflected in the equilibrium party platforms, but here it's just what's changing on the demand side that is inducing corresponding changes on the supply side. Then we compute equilibrium vote shares. So let's define pi ijp, the vote share of type ij for party P. And under class identity, voters sort across parties by their income. So the upper class conservative and the upper class progressive predominant for Party R, predominantly vote for Party L. Under cultural identity, voters sort across parties by their culture. So the conservatives now predominantly vote for R, and the progressives vote for L. And moreover, as identity shifts from class to culture, Party R gains voters amongst the conservatives and to a lesser extent amongst the lower class. So this is, of course, fully consistent with the evidence on realignment of voters across parties if we interpret education as being correlated with cultural progressiveness. And I think it's important to stress that this happens in a model in which supply changes too. Sometimes you hear the argument in the literature that because party platforms have changed, this is the reason why you observe the realignment. So papers have been written saying the Democratic Party in the US has become more progressive on its cultural policies. It has cared less about redistribution, and as a result, some lower class voters have abandoned the Democratic Party. That's factually true, but it's not evidence that the origin of the shift is on the supply side. The voters who have abandoned the Democratic Party may have done so because of changes that originate on the demand side, not on the supply side of the political marketplace. Last, with this simple model, we ask how, nevertheless, this model can accommodate changes from the supply to the demand, allowing for political persuasion. And so in particular, we study how we assume that parties can influence the strength of stereotypical thinking, the degree to which these individuals overweight the realizations of these random variables based on their identity. They can do so with some costly effort. And this costly effort that we call propaganda, we assume that can increase or dampen stereotypes. So parties can choose to exacerbate stereotypes or make voters more rational. Their propaganda cannot be targeted to groups. So if I try to influence the stereotypes of the conservatives, I'm also influencing the stereotypes of the progressives. But nevertheless, this propaganda tends to be more effective, consistent with the evidence, on the groups that are overrepresented by the party. And then so to make an example, suppose that voters are identified with their cultural group, and suppose that Trump makes a statement during his campaign. He makes a statement about immigrants. He could say, immigrants are nice people, or he could say, immigrants are criminal. If he says immigrants are criminal, this exacerbates the stereotypes of conservatives who dislike immigrants, but the statement is also heard by the progressives, and this also exacerbates the stereotype of the progressives who realize that they are different from this political leader. Nevertheless, the effect is assumed to be stronger on the progressives. And then we ask what happens when these political parties simultaneously choose policy platforms and this costly propaganda to maximize the vote shares, taking the voter's identity as given. And the intuition here is that, remember that these two parties are choosing different points in the policy space. They diverge. And so their optimal propaganda would like to shift the distribution of voters' preferences closer to the platform that they will announce in equilibrium. Which means that the right-wing party would like to exacerbate the extremism of the conservative. It would like to make the conservatives more right-wing, and it would like to moderate the extremism of the voters, of the progressive voters who vote Democrat. He cannot do both under these assumptions, but he is also more effective and knows that on his own conservative voters. And so the result is that in equilibrium, both parties put effort to make voters more extreme, to exacerbate stereotypical thinking of the voters, because the votes that they gain by doing so are larger than the votes that they lose. Moreover, there is a complementarity between voters' preferences and political propaganda. So if voters are more extreme in their policy preferences, the parties will choose more extreme positions, more extreme platforms, and this makes them create stronger incentive to invest in inflaming propaganda, in becoming even more extreme in their propaganda. And so there is a feedback effect. Voters' extremism induces parties to be more extremist in their propaganda, and this in turn makes voters also more extreme. And of course you need to have an interior equilibrium to assume that the cost of propaganda is sufficiently convex. And finally, the content of propaganda here is determined by the prevailing identity. So if voters are identified by their economic group, parties emphasize class struggle. If voters identify with their cultural group, then propaganda emphasizes cultural conflict. The last thing that I want to discuss is how this framework can also be used to study the effects of specific shocks. So far, the origin of these movements in the model is an increased relevance of cultural policies like immigration or civil rights. But similar effects can also be obtained by specific economic shocks, and in particular by trade shocks. So suppose that you take the same model, but there are two sectors now an export sector and an import sector, and this is a small open economy. To preserve the model as before, taxable income is in the export sector, so nothing changes here. But now you also have a non-taxable endowment, call it ETA, which is more likely to be employed in the export sector if the individual who owns the endowment is progressive, and otherwise employed in the import sector. So education here determines your skill level. Your skill level is correlated with whether you are employed in an import competing or export competing sector, and it also is correlated with your cultural preferences. And then there is an import tariff as an additional policy tool that generates revenue which is used to finance the public good. And there are many localities in this small open economy that differ in their trade exposure. Some are more exposed to import competition than others. The groups with which you identify are national groups, like before, not your local group, but your national group. And as before, identity trades off contrast and similarity. But now, group contrast is defined at the national level between progressive or conservatives, or upper classes and lower classes. And they are the same in all localities because they are national groups. While similarity is defined as the similarity between myself, who lives in a specific region with a given exposure, and this national group. And so the result here is that in the more exposed localities, the conservatives are more likely to identify with their cultural groups than in the less exposed localities. Because in the more exposed localities, the conservative want higher taxes, and higher taxes is a feature of the conservative group, because on average, the conservative group is more exposed. While the effect is asymmetric on the progressives are not more likely to identify based on their cultural group if they are in a more exposed locality, because there the effect goes in the opposite direction. And so you can then generate predictions about what happens in the contrast between more exposed and less exposed localities. In the more exposed localities, the conservative groups are more likely to identify with their cultural group, while the progressives are not affected by exposure. And so, on average, voters want more protection, of course, in the more exposed localities, but they also want more restrictive cultural policies, because they are more likely to be culturally identified. Their preferences on tax policy are ambiguous, because the lower class want, the redistributive conflict is dampened, but the effect is opposite on the lower class and the upper class. However, if the lower class is a majority, the effect of the lower class prevails, and so the lower class who are culturally identified demand less redistribution. So the demand for redistribution by the lower classes is predicted to be lower in the more exposed localities. Suppose now that you have local representatives who are elected in these localities. They would campaign on different policy platforms, and in particular, all representatives in the more exposed localities choose more conservative policy platforms, but the Republican, the Party R, who internalizes more fully the welfare of the conservatives, does grow so to a greater extent. And so there is going to be more policy divergence in the policy platforms of the more exposed localities on the cultural policy, and less divergence on the tax rate between parties. On vote shares, you also get similar predictions as in the simpler model that I discussed before, namely, in the more exposed localities, the Party R gains votes among conservatives and amongst the poor, and loses votes amongst the progressives. And finally, in the more exposed localities, Party R engages in more conservative cultural propaganda because of the different identities. So you can see how these economic shocks can have effects on voters' preferences and party positions that are very far-reaching and very far away from trade policy. And so the last thing that we do is to take some of these predictions to the data using the approach that is now standard in the literature thanks to the work of David Autor and his co-authors. So we look at the exposure of US areas to imports from China. So the treatment is the change in import penetration in US commuter zones, which we instrument with the similar change in other developed countries. The outcome, so the literature has mostly looked at the vote shares. Here, the outcome that we study first, we take 2 questions from the CCS survey on attitudes towards redistribution and immigration with higher values, denoting that you are more in favor of immigrants or redistribution. And then we have 2 samples, a panel with fewer respondents, about 8,000 respondents, and a shorter time period, and 2 repeated cross-sections over a longer period and more respondents that we observe. And in the panel, we regress the change in the opinions of the respondent to a bunch of standard controls and the change in import penetration. While in the cross-section, essentially estimate a different equation where D is a dummy variable for the second period, which we interact with the treatment and with controls, and we have the commuter zones and the wave fixed effects. And as you see, in both the panel and the cross-section, as expected, voters become more, voters who are more exposed to import competition become more conservative towards immigrants and less demanding of redistribution. And the theory, remember, has specific predictions about heterogeneity. So it's the conservatives who become more averse to immigrants, while the effects on redistribution should be opposite on different income groups. The poor demand less redistribution in the more exposed areas. The rich are more in favor, but the prediction on the rich is actually not so robust to some changes in the model. And so we measure being conservative or progressive based on whether you are reported to be religious or secular. And as you see, with regard to immigration, it is the religious individuals, so the more conservative individuals who exacerbate their aversion to immigrants. With regard to redistribution, the lower class demand less redistribution. The result on the upper middle class is not what we expected, but it's smaller in number, and the prediction, as I said, is less clear-cut. Last, we look at the evidence on the supply side. And so the treatment is still the same. It's increased exposure to imports from China. But now the outcome is a measure of the behavior of the elected representatives in the districts. And in particular, it's the change in the moral content of their congressional speeches, which we measure following the recent work of Ben Enke as the frequency of universalist relative to communitarian keywords, which is really what corresponds to psi in the model or to q in the model. If you are more universalistic, you are more progressive. And this can be taken either as a measure of propaganda or as a measure of policy positioning, probably both. And we estimate the change in the moral content of congressional speeches as a function of controls and of the treatment of interest. And here the period is the entire period between 2000 and 2016, and we adjust localities for redistricting as has been done in the literature. And the prediction, remember, is that you become more conservative in the speeches and less universalistic in the more exposed districts, and this is what the data say. The theory also says that this effect should be stronger if there are more conservative voters in the district. And so we split the sample between districts that have a share of white non-Hispanic voters above the national median, with the idea that the ethnic minorities are likely to be progressive. And it's these districts with above median white non-Hispanic voters who actually are driving the overall average effect. And finally, remember that the theory predicts that this outcome should be stronger in the Republican candidates because it's the Republicans who react to these changes. And this is what the data say, no matter how you define Republican, whether you look at the party of the respondent, of the representative at the beginning of the sample, at the end of the sample, whether you restrict the sample to districts where the elected representative belong to the same party, or at the beginning or the end. In all these cases, it's always the Republican representative who become more communitarian in the more exposed districts. So let me wrap up. We think, and I hope to have convinced some of you, that this framework of endogenous identity provides a rich framework to study puzzling political phenomena. It can explain why we see systematic distortions in political beliefs, but only on issues where social groups are polarized. And identity can be seen as a mechanism that amplifies and propagates the effects of economic and social change. And in particular, changes that increase the relevance of cultural issues, or shocks like trade and technology, not all economic shocks, but some economic shocks that increase the economic conflict associated with education, should be expected to lead to the emergence of a new cleavage based on culture and education, a dampening of redistributive conflict between voters and parties, and the realignment of voters across parties. And this framework can also accommodate room for political propaganda and explain why propaganda can amplify extremism. And of course, this is only the beginning of our research agenda, which I think can be explored much more deeply and more fruitfully. In particular, one would like to have more direct evidence of belief distortions being correlated with social identities. This has been done in the social psychology literature, but I'm sure those results can be improved on the mechanisms of identity formation. A second line of research is linked to the idea that parties represent social groups. So if new cleavages emerge in society, how does the political system adapt? Clearly, the answer is going to be different depending on the electoral rule, but how do party organizations change when these cleavages emerge? I think studying political persuasion, to me, is a very important area of research. Of course, political scientists have done it extensively, but this framework suggests that political persuasion should not be seen just as transmission of information, but as something that shapes your preferences or your beliefs more directly. And finally, there certainly are other episodes in history or other contexts in which identity can lead to fruitful analysis. So let me stop here and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Guido. A very rich talk, as expected. We are running a little late, but I think we have some time for questions. let me take a few and then I can coordinate. Yeah, I don't know if, yes, please.
How you see the influence of structural change, because maybe 30 to 40% of traditional manufactural jobs have been lost.
Understanding.
Excuse me, there is a strange echo, so we...
Yeah.
Can you
It's
understand?
difficult to...
I cannot hear well.
We cannot hear very well. We can hear it's very loud, but there is an echo, so...
How you see... Is it good now? How you see that 40 or 30 or 40% of traditional manufactural jobs have been lost, and those people who have changed to conservatives are maybe those people who have lost their jobs or are afraid that they are losing them. How you see this?
I do not understand.
Shall we take 2, 3, and then Oriana, can you act as a...
No, I'll relate the question.
intermediary.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so the gentleman was asking, how do you see the fact that thousands of jobs in manufacturing have been lost? How does that fit in this framework?
Let me take a few more, and then...
How do you think about your theory in the context of growing financial income inequality, especially the outsized returns by people who had initial wealth, from the boomers generation, people who owned urban homes and so forth? Does that fit with the patterns that you describe?
Let me take one more, and then... Yes, please. Over there is...
Can you hear me? And how do you see the role of media in shaping these groups?
Okay, shall I?
Let's go with these 3, and then...
Sorry. Sure.
Do you answer these 3, and then...
Yeah. So on the first 2 questions, which are related, clearly one of the effects of trade shocks and technology shocks is to drive losses of jobs in manufacturing. So that's the mechanism at the heart of this model, in the sense that these job losses are not equally distributed in the population. They are concentrated in some social groups, in some local communities, and what is distinctive of these social groups and these local communities that are losing from trade is the fact that they are less educated, more provincial in some cases, and more conservative in their attitudes. And so it's the economic the correlation between the economic consequences of the shock and the cultural feature of the groups that are hurt by these shocks that is driving these identity shifts. And it's not economic disappointment in general. It's not general economic losses, because those would not be correlated with your cultural views. And in fact, to explore a bit more in detail this argument, we have run the same set of regressions that I have shown, adding technology shocks and adding a measure of the financial crisis shock, which has been studied by others as being through what happens to the real estate market. And the results of trade shocks remain as I described them when you add these additional shocks. The technology shocks give you similar effects, but they are less robust, and that's why I have not shown them. Maybe they are less precisely measured. The financial crisis shocks don't correlate with these preferences. So that's the idea that the shocks that induce identity shifts are those that emphasize the divide between social groups that are different in some relevant dimension. That's the insight that we gain. The media, I think, is a very important question. We don't know. I'm sure that that's a very fruitful area to be studied. There is some work that we have been doing with Marco Manacorda and Andrea Tesei, which is related to this, where we show that areas in Europe where there has been more exposure to the new 3G and 4G technologies, exploiting a gradual diffusion of these technologies, have become more communitarian in the policy views of the respondents and are more likely to vote for the right-wing populist parties, interacted with local unemployment. So the combination of being exposed to the social media and being deprived economically seems to have changed attitudes in the direction of being more communitarian. And so one interpretation along this framework would be that social media have somehow amplified the effect of this economic disappointment on the more conservative and communitarian side of policy views. But that's something preliminary and that remains to be studied and very fruitful, I think.
So we are already 15 minutes late. So unless there are any pressing questions, we can stop here, and I'm sure we can continue this conversation afterwards in private. Thank you very much, Guido, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you.